Greetings, salutations, and a bunch of other words that are more appropriate to start out a video with than, hey, it's your boy Dave. I feel dirty just doing that. Anyway, this is Zilog and Moto, and yes, my name is Dave, and I'm your host as we take a look back at the 8 and 16-bit era of Sega consoles and the games that were released for them. This channel is a little bit different than others because not only is there a fairly strict focus on just the games released for the Master System, Genesis/Mega Drive, Sega CD, and 32X, but I don't just have some game footage and commentary. I make sure to actually look at the package as well, including what's in the box, to try to capture what it was like to pick out one of these games and bring it home to play. When you total up the list of English language releases for all four of those platforms, and English language meaning games presented in English, and not just games that were released in the United States, you come up with about 1,275 games. That is a lot of games to review. There are definitely times when I think about the scope of this project, and I want to go back to myself 3 years ago and say, look, this is going to take a lot of time and money. Are you sure you don't want to just keep collecting comic books? And yeah, I could have done that, but I really enjoy coming up with these reviews, researching the history behind some of these titles, and of course actually playing the good ones. And finally, meeting a lot of great people on Twitter in the process. So it's definitely worth it. If this subject interests you, in-depth reviews of these classic and or infamous titles, think about subscribing to the channel because there's a long road still ahead and I'd love for you to join me. One of the things that occurs when reviewing games for 4 different consoles is that there's some overlap with series of games. Sometimes it's virtually the same game on different platforms, for instance, Cliffhanger or Three Ninjas Kick Back on the Sega Genesis and Sega CD, and sometimes it's a series that starts out on a lower platform and then has sequels that appear on the next console, like Phantasy Star, Alex Kidd, or Wonder Boy. And then there's this week's title, Gauntlet 4 for the Genesis, which is sort of an amalgamation of the two. As you can tell by the title of this game, Gauntlet 4 is the 4th game in the Gauntlet series, releasing on the Genesis and Mega Drive in 1993, with releases in the United States, Europe, and Japan all occurring at about the same time. But with the caveat that the Japanese release was simply labeled Gauntlet rather than Gauntlet 4. Why was that? Well, a few reasons, but the simplest reason is that Gauntlet 4 contains a port of the original arcade version of Gauntlet. And since ports of Gauntlet 2 and 3 didn't exist for Sega platforms, it was decided it would be less confusing to just call it Gauntlet. And honestly, Gauntlet 4 is kind of an odd name for this game. Gauntlet 2 was the true sequel to the original in the arcades, even though it did share hardware with the original cabinet. And Gauntlet 3 was either an Atari Lynx exclusive or an example of Tengen and US Gold going rogue and releasing their own Gauntlet 3 with the subtitle The Final Quest in Europe for the Amiga, Atari ST, Commodore 64, etc. So what does Gauntlet 4 contain that necessitates the need to call it something different than just Gauntlet in the United States and Europe? Clearly, it can't just be a port of the arcade game, no matter how good a port it is. Well, there definitely is more here than you might be expecting, and we'll get into all of that. But first, let's see what you got when you brought this one home from the store. And this is Gauntlet 4, clearly indicated by a slightly smaller original Gauntlet logo with a giant 4 in Roman numerals below. This might be the most prominent Roman numeral 4 I can think of in a title besides the film Rocky IV. This case has seen a bit of wear, but it could be a lot worse. The corners on the spine are a bit worn, and there's also some scratches and nicks to the outer cover, especially on the rear toward the bottom. There's also some minor edge wear at the top of the front inner cover where it's ridden up a bit. But probably the most obvious issue is the removal of the hang tab at the top, which in and of itself isn't bad as they made a pretty clean cut, but it looks like they nicked up the outer cover in the process. However, other than all that, the inner cover is held up well and there's no additional water or sun damage. As far as the front cover goes, you can see why it was important to have a large Roman numeral 4 front and center to differentiate this game from others, and that's because the logo and artwork are largely unchanged from the release of the first Gauntlet on the NES. And in fact, eagle-eyed viewers a few minutes ago may have noticed that the cover for the Atari Lynx game, Gauntlet the Third Encounter,
uses the same artwork as well. Tengen made no bones about it, even though they were throwing that big 4 on there. They wanted people to know that this was the same Gauntlet that they knew and loved. However, another big 4 on the cover that I have to mention is the very visible yellow 4-player star right at the top. This is an important distinction because many home ports of Gauntlet only supported 2 players rather than 4. But Sega decided that Gauntlet would be the first game to support their brand new Team Player adapter that allowed for 4 controllers to plug into a Genesis. I don't have a Team Player adapter, and I don't know if I've even seen one since I started collecting, but I'll have to remedy that at some point. Flipping over the back, and you can see that while Tengen still had their rear covers laying out on a somewhat bland white background, they had rearranged things a bit at this point, so that it wasn't just the super bland 2x2 screenshot layout as seen on games like Hard Driving and Road Blasters. I actually didn't mind that old style, but I do prefer them moving things around a bit and minimizing the flavor text. The screenshots are okay, but I do like that they did have one that showed a 4-player party with the emphasis that they were putting on that, and a shot of one of the dragons showing off part of what makes Gauntlet 4 different. Also, if you look very closely, you can tell that these were all taken from the Japanese version of the game, as it says Gauntlet at the top of the status bar rather than Gauntlet 4, like you'll see in a minute. Finally, if you look down at the bottom, you'll see EA's 4-way play logo indicating that Gauntlet 4 supports not only Sega's Team Player, but also the 4-way play, which had come out earlier that year. Opening up the case, and the manual is in great shape. One thing you may immediately notice, if you're used to other Tengen releases, is that this manual is thick. And there is lots of good information in here, especially considering the fact that part of the game is just the arcade version of Gauntlet that doesn't really require a lot of explanation. Part of the reason for the girth is Gauntlet 4's Quest mode, which is the real meat and potatoes of this release, and why Tengen chose to call it something other than just Gauntlet again. I like all the extra info included, but the screenshots are somewhat useless as they're black and white and low res, making it hard to see what they're trying to show. Okay, that's the package. Let's get to the game itself and see what makes Gauntlet 4 stand out. One thing with previous Tengen games that I reviewed on the channel is that they're largely just been ports of older Atari arcade games. So far, I've looked at Hard Driving in episode 43, Road Blasters in episode 83, and most recently Paperboy in episode 136. But one thing I'll say about all those ports is that they were competent. Meaning, if you were a fan of the arcade game, you probably would enjoy the Tengen version on the Genesis. But also, all of those ports were just okay. I mean, they got the job done, sure, but none of them really felt like the developers working on the ports gave their best effort, either due to being uninspired or more than likely budget and time constraints. For instance, with Paperboy, sure, it looked decent and it captured most of the gags from the arcade machine, but the digital speech is some of the worst I've heard on a console, and I refuse to believe that that was an artistic decision to keep it close to the arcade, for reasons I'll get into further with Gauntlet 4. Then there's Hard Driving, which I've got to say is a faithful, albeit downgraded version of the arcade original, due to the lack of any kind of 3D hardware in the Genesis. The problem is if you've ever played Hard Driving, you know there's no substance to the game, and you can finish it in about 15 minutes, and the developers did nothing to the home version to try to enhance that. The best of the bunch is Road Blasters, which shouldn't be too surprising as it's the best arcade game of the 3, and the Genesis port is faithful to that, but again, it just felt somewhat bare bones in that you got a port of the arcade game from 1987, and that's it. I suppose at this point I should mention that I've also looked at Pit Fighter, but honestly, the less said about that atrocity, the better. Gauntlet 4, on the other hand, does a lot more than just bring the original arcade game home, and that starts with the developer, which was one of the most surprising things that I ran into when looking at the game. Gauntlet 4 was developed by M2. Yes, that M2. The same M2 that has been behind countless ports of Sega games to newer platforms, and the Sega Genesis and TurboGrafx 16 mini consoles. It turns out Gauntlet 4 was their first effort, and after playing Gauntlet 4, their mastery of the Genesis platform that was shown in the port of Darius on the Genesis Mini makes a lot more sense. But let's start out with arcade mode. The manual describes arcade mode as a pixel-perfect conversion of the original Gauntlet arcade game. I'm not gonna lie, first reading that statement, it comes across as being a bit full of braggadocio. Having said that though, Gauntlet did come out 8 years previously, all the way back in 1985, and its main CPU was a Motorola 68010, just one step up from the 68000 that powers the Genesis. And at 7.159 MHz, actually clocked a bit slower than said 68000. Along with an 8-bit MOS 6502 and Yamaha YM2151 for sound, similar to how the Genesis leverages the Z80 and the Yamaha YM2612, so it's not like it would be technically impossible for the Genesis to replicate the power of the original arcade board. Okay, technical mumbo-jumbo aside, is the pixel-perfect conversion statement accurate? More or less. There may be some colors missing here or there, but for all intents and purposes, this is the Gauntlet you played in the arcades. And in fact, I would say it's actually better than the arcade game for one simple reason: background music. While the arcade version of Gauntlet has limited music included as it focused more on sound effects and digital speech, Gauntlet 4 features a full soundtrack to go along with that, and honestly, after playing Gauntlet with a proper soundtrack, it's really hard to go back to the arcade version, which just sounds incredibly odd with only the constant dings and explosions as you progress. Normally I wait until closer to the end of the review to focus on a game's sound, but for Gauntlet 4 it merits mention earlier in the review. The reason for this is because of that soundtrack I just mentioned. This isn't just any soundtrack in a Genesis game that stands out due to its absence from the arcade machine. And sure, just about any soundtrack that M2 could have produced here would have been better than the nothing that's present in the arcade version. But M2 didn't include just any soundtrack in Gauntlet 4. On the contrary, I would say that Gauntlet 4 has one of the best soundtracks that I've heard on the Genesis. It's flat out phenomenal. And while I don't have a specific top 10 list for soundtracks on the Genesis off the top of my head, it has to be in the running for that list. The synths are clear as a bell and the instrumentation is fantastic. Since I've been doing Zilog and Moto, the only other game to just come out of nowhere and blow me away with its music like this is Decap Attack. Upon researching this, there's a very good reason that the soundtrack is so good, as the composers were Hitoshi Sakamoto and Masaharu Iwata, and even if you don't know their names, like I didn't, chances are you are familiar with their works, as they also provided the soundtracks for more famous titles like Ogre Battle, Final Fantasy Tactics, Final Fantasy XII, and Odin Sphere, among tons of other titles. Along with the soundtrack, the sound effects are pretty close to the arcade as well, managing to still include all the digital speech from the original, even without a dedicated speech processor like the Gauntlet hardware used. And in fact, hearing how good the speech was in Gauntlet 4 just made me mad all over again about how abysmal it is in Paperboy, and what a lazy job was done with that port. Getting back to the actual content of Gauntlet 4, there's a lot more here than just a fantastic arcade port and a phenomenal soundtrack. The other main focus to Gauntlet 4 is its quest mode. Quest mode is more or less what it sounds like, in that it's Gauntlet, but with a loose story tied to it. In quest mode, you pick one of the 4 character types, name your character, and then after a few pages of intro scrolls passed on the screen, you're deposited in the courtyard of a castle with a few identical vendors ready to sell you healing items, armor, weapons, and various other sundries for you to use in your adventure. The castle has 4 10-level towers for you to explore, with each having an associated element, i.e. the fire tower, water tower, earth tower, and wind tower, and an eventual dragon for you to slay before you can move on to the castle itself. Each of the levels plays similar to the Gauntlet arcade game, with one twist. Each level has multiple paths up and down to the adjoining levels, and to fully clear out the tower, you'll have to use some trial and error to figure out which sets of stairs will need to be used to hit the necessary trap switches, as in the beginning, only certain sections of the levels will be exposed. I'll admit, at first this was a bit frustrating coming straight from the arcade game, which is more straightforward with defined level beginnings and exits, but the more I played it, the more I appreciated the somewhat puzzly trial and error aspects of the game. It's still somewhat repetitive to be sure, but honestly, all RPGs are to an extent. This leads me to my only 2 complaints about the game. I mentioned earlier that during the unboxing segment, that the manual for Gauntlet 4 is pretty substantial, and it is, especially by Tengen Genesis standards. So you would think that with that extra manual girth that everything in the game would be fully covered without question. Well, that's not quite the case. During the quest mode section of the manual, the basics are covered for the game, including some nice charts of all the available items that you can purchase for the characters. However, what's not included is details on how the game's leveling up system works. Sure, it explains how to level up your characters, but there's some important details that are left out. When leveling your characters, they each have 7 categories where they can improve. 1, the amount of health that you have is obvious. However, the other 6 aren't even mentioned in the manual, so it's not clear what the attributes are, what they do, or even where the values are coming from. Thankfully, there's an FAQ on GameFAQs that at least explains what each of the icons mean, but it's almost like they forgot to include the page that covered it. I do like the system in that it gives you some flexibility and strategy as to how to best improve your character, rather than standard generic level ups, but coming into it cold is confusing at best. My other complaint about the game is the save system. Not only does quest mode have a rather long password system rather than battery backup, it actually uses 2 passwords. Yes, that's right, 2 passwords. The first password captures your character's stats, so what level you're at, which items you have, etc. And this password can also be used to import your character into battle mode, which is nice, I guess. However, the second password is used for saving your status in whichever tower you happen to be making your way through at the time. So if you want to properly continue your game in quest mode, you will need to enter both passwords. This seems like the perfect opportunity to use battery backup, and especially after reviewing Hardball 3 last week with its use of the battery to cover settings and progress, it feels like a huge miss. I suppose both the password saves and the poorly defined leveling system aren't the end of the world, especially in 2022, but I've got to call them out with the level of quality that the rest of the game has. And to be clear, Gauntlet 4 is quality. I want to stress that. It's by far the best game from Tengen that I've played so far on the channel, and that's a combination of having a solid original game in the arcade version of Gauntlet, plus a fantastic development team in M2, Sakamoto, and Iwata. If you want to grab 3 of your friends and pair up the best port of the arcade version from the era, or go on an adventure with the surprisingly addicting quest mode, you should definitely track down a copy of Gauntlet 4. And seeing how there's this theme of 4s, Gauntlet 4, it supports 4 players, I thought it would only be appropriate to give the game 4 stars. If you're not a fan of Gauntlet, the arcade game, then first I have to ask what's wrong with you, but if that is the case, then knock that ranking down a notch. But the solid quest mode and soundtrack still keeps the game worth a look.
Okay, that was Gauntlet 4. Like many gamers, I have a hard time with a backlog, mainly consisting of more modern games that I want to play, and oftentimes it's tough to balance those newer games with playing these older titles for the reviews. But sometimes one of these classics really grabs you, and you end up with 5 hours of footage to sift through that only felt like 2 or 3, and that's when you know you've got a great one, which is exactly what happened with Gauntlet 4. If you're a Genesis fan, I stress, don't sleep on this one. And we're going to see it again in the Best of 2022 list at the end of the year. I can guarantee it. Next week on Zilog and Moto, it's another Tengen title. Believe me, that was not planned, it's just the way the schedule worked out. It's actually a sequel to one of the titles discussed in today's review, and I gotta be honest, I'm already mentally preparing myself to be disappointed at what I'm expecting to be the first subpar scoring review of the year. But to be fair, I've never played the Genesis version of this game, so who knows, maybe I'll run into yet another game that was developed by a legendary staff that no one knew about at the time. You never know. Please remember to subscribe if you like this video, and remember, whatever you like to play, have fun, and be excellent to each other. Later.